Today we revisit a Culture and Conversation segment, my interview with Dr. Frank Sysyn about the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen and the tradition of Ukrainian military valor.
Розмови про культуру, спонсоровані святом Дня Незалежності.
When most people ruminate on their personal or group history, they are inevitably drawn to the episodes of persecution and suffering they encounter there. This is a natural psychological process. The history of Ukraine is rife with painful episodes that draw people's attention, and we hear about them often. Here I would like to focus on a fundamentally inspirational time in Ukrainian history, the period of the inception and activity of the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, who helped Ukraine achieve independence in 1918. Many of us have heard of these brave men and, yes, women, but what do we really know about them? Professor of History Dr. Frank Sysyn will enlighten us. Who were the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen and what was the context of their formation?
Ukrainian Siege Riflemen were formed at the end of 1913 and really in 1914 after the outbreak of the First World War. They were formed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the province Crown Land of Galicia, in which in the eastern half of that province, Ukrainians were the majority. And they were extremely important in Ukrainian history because they represented the return or restoration of struggle for a Ukrainian state. In many ways, we can say that the 18th century was the last century in which there was an attempt to form a Ukrainian independent political unity. That is the age of Ivan Mazepa. And after the loss of Poltava, and later even the aspirations for struggling, the Ukrainian emigres of the 18th century, and we can say finally ending in 1791 when Vasil Kapnis goes to Berlin to try and convince Berlin possibly to help Ukrainians. We can say the 19th century was a century in which Ukrainian movement was concentrated on nation forming, that is, forming of a culture, spreading of the Ukrainian idea. But it was only in 1895, at the end of the century, that once again the idea that there should be a Ukrainian political independence comes to the fore among Ukrainian thinkers. At that time, because there were constitutional rights in Austria-Hungary, and although the province of Galicia was largely controlled by the Polish elite, Ukrainians were able to form sporting groups, somewhat paramilitary groups, Sich, Lug, and various others. And with this came the idea, as with the youth organizations such as Plast, that there should be a Ukrainian state. When the First World War comes then, Ukrainians are willing to fight in the Austro-Hungarian army if the government will allow them to have a legion or a group. The Habsburg government at this time needed support and was willing to allow such a formation, although it kept it to a really rather small group. That is, many more young Ukrainians wanted to volunteer, as they were volunteers, to join this Ukrainian formation, rather than to be just conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian army. That also meant that in many ways it was the intellectual, political elite of Ukrainians, although there were many people from village life as well who joined this military formation.
So you're saying that there was a cap on this, the number?
Yes, very definitely a cap, and many were sent home who tried to volunteer because initially they're only taking 2,000 into the unit. Later the units begin to grow. Of course, from the point of view of the Habsburgs, they needed this support from many of the nations or groups or nationalities of the empire, but there were, of course, contending ones. They also allow the formation of Polish legions, and obviously the goal of the Polish legions to restore a Polish state and that of the Ukrainians could conflict. Although we should remember that from the point of view of the Habsburgs, that Ukrainian state was not going to be in the Habsburg Empire. These groups are joining to fight against the Russian Empire with the hope that in this case, the Ukrainian territories of the Russian Empire could eventually be, they could win support with a central power victory, with the victory of the Habsburgs over the Russians, to allow a Ukrainian state, or at least autonomous unit, to be formed on that territory in the east.
Now, what were some of the consequences of the Russian occupation of Galicia during World War I?
The Russian occupation of Galicia was viewed as the reunification of the Russian lands. The Romanov family was involved in this and travels to these territories. Indeed, we can argue that one of the major war aims of Russia was the occupation of eastern Galicia. It was for them very important. It would have stamped out the Ukrainian movement in their minds. It also would fulfill certain neo-Slavophile and Orthodox dreams. There also is a persecution of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. So from the point of view of St. Petersburg, this was extremely important as they move into their territories. I might add that Ukrainians were not the only group to suffer. The Russian authorities treat the Jewish population of eastern Galicia very badly, and there are long-term memories of that as well. And the Ukrainian cause, therefore, is associated with Vienna and to a degree with Berlin against St. Petersburg because of the Russian imperial authorities' attitudes. This is also the time, as soon as the war begins, that they close down all Ukrainian activities in eastern Ukraine. There had been a little bit of liberalization after 1905. Already it was declining just before the war, and this gives the Russian imperial authorities the excuse to clamp down on all Ukrainian activities.
And were any well-known figures repressed at that time?
Yes, well, first the Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Metropolitan Andriy Sheptytsky, is arrested, deported to Russia, where he spends much of the war, and this was associated, therefore, with the attacks on the church. Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who was a professor of the University of Lviv, was a Russian citizen, and he hoped that by returning to the Russian Empire, he would in some way show that the Ukrainian movement was not anti-St. Petersburg. He hoped, I think, to save the Ukrainian activities in Kyiv because of this. He is arrested and as well deported into the Russian heartland. And then throughout eastern Galicia, almost all Ukrainian activists were under surveillance. The prosvita, or reading room, in villages were often disbanded by the Russian authorities. I might say that for the Russian army, this posed considerable problems because a large number of the troops coming into eastern Galicia were Ukrainians. And in a certain way, this was a meeting of eastern and western Ukraine. That is, for the first time, these people often came into contact, realized they spoke the same language, had the same culture. We have this very nicely described in the literary works of Vasil Stefanik, who shows how the Russian authorities' troops coming to a Ukrainian village see a portrait of Shevchenko. Generally, the portraits of Shevchenko were reasons for the authorities to move against you, and yet they tell a simple village woman whose sons have gone to fight for the Sich Riflemen that we respect the same Shevchenko that you do. And this, of course, is a beginning of understanding that there is a Ukraine that transcends the borders of empires.
The veterans of the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen later formed the Ukrainian Galician Army. How crucial was this army in the struggle for the independence of Western Ukraine?
Yes, the Sich Riflemen are still fighting the Austro-Hungarian army in November, late October, early November of 1918. This is the point where the Central Powers are defeated, that in the last phases of the empire, although the imperial dynasty in Vienna had begun to give more concessions to Ukrainians, that the empire is breaking up into various national units. Ukrainians seized the march on this issue in many ways by declaring on November 1st, 1918, the existence of the Western Ukrainian Republic. I might add there already had been since 1917 the Ukrainian National Republic or Ukrainian People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. This surprised the dominant Polish authorities in Galicia, who were within 11 days going to declare not in eastern Galicia, but in the central Polish territories, a Polish state. and Poles and Ukrainians then come to a war over Eastern Galicia, in which Ukrainians were the majority of the population, although not necessarily the majority of the population in the main cities such as Lviv. In this struggle, the Ukrainian Galician Army is formed, in which the best units, one can argue, come as the Sich Riflemen join them in this struggle and provide much of the leadership. The Ukrainian Galician Army at its height may have had as much as 100,000 men in arms. This was a tremendous mobilization of the population. Their major problem was that, unlike Poland, which could turn to the victorious allies and above all France for support, the Ukrainian cause could turn to no one, and it hoped initially that the Ukrainian National Republic, or then the government, which is being restored just at this time in eastern Ukraine, would be able to provide them support. But it, of course, is facing the Bolsheviks and the Russian Whites, and so there are too many enemies for these two Ukrainian armies, which eventually will come together. The Ukrainian Galician Army fights until the spring and early summer of 1919. It's ultimately driven out of eastern Galicia because of the arrival of the so-called Haller troops, the troops that had been came from France, largely armed by France, with Poles from various groups, including from North America, fighting. This drives the Ukrainian Galician Army across the Zbruch, those who are not imprisoned or interned or flee to Czechoslovakia, which is also arising as a new state. That struggle, as with the formation of the Sich Riflemen, can be seen as crucial moments in Ukrainian history. In 1914, because it meant the restoration of a struggle for Ukrainian independence, and then the struggle for Galicia because it showed the ability of the Ukrainian movement to mobilize a large part of the population in its support, and of course to reject Polish rule, which is imposed in the middle of 1919.
Розмови про культуру, спонсоровані Святом Дня Незалежності.